Hello, everyone. Just waiting for some more people to join, and then we'll begin shortly. Just waiting. I'll give it a couple of minutes. Morning. Okay, I think I'll start. Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second session in our quarterly webinar series. My name is Melissa. I'm the Marketing Communications Manager here at Urban Fox, and I'll be moderating the webinar again. Today, we'll essentially be talking about a commercial approach that could help local authorities unlock up to 10 times private sector investment for on-street EV charging projects. As well as being quite an informative session, we also want this webinar to be an interactive one. So please feel free to drop your questions into the chat, and we'll try and get them answered in the Q&A section in the second half. So I'll introduce our panelists. First, we have Steve Cresswell, the Contracts Manager at the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, who will be sharing lessons learned for delivering effective procurements. Next, we have Simon Rook, our Commercial Director here at Urban Fox, who will be offering ideas on how to mobilise large private investment from the Levi funding allocation. And finally, we have Stephen Rennie, our Bid Director at Urban Fox, who will be discussing the contracting approach to attract private investment. Welcome, everyone. I'll just run through how the webinar's going to go today. So each panelist will give a short presentation. This will be followed by a moderated discussion, and then we'll open the floor up to questions from our audience. And again, I'm encouraging everyone to actively participate by asking questions. You can do this using the Q&A feature on your screen. And please state on the panel who the question is for. So without further ado, let me introduce Steve Cresswell, who will be talking about procurement and lessons learned.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Hello, good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you all virtually. I'm Steve Cresswell. I am the contract manager for the local EV charging infrastructure, the Levi Fund, and I'm going to talk to you today about some of the lessons learned surrounding some of the procurement. Could I have the next slide, please? So, as part of the government's net zero plan strategy for 2050, on 30th of March 2023, the Department for Transport launched the Levi scheme for local charge points, which was £343 million, and there was a further £37.8 million allocated for capability resource funding for local authorities, which is to recruit expertise in that field to help deliver the on-street charging scheme. There was also an on-street residential charge point scheme, AUX, which is coming towards the end now, and with around we've installed already around 4,000 charge points, and there's another 10,000 in the pipeline. Could I have the next slide, please? So the low emission vehicle infrastructure fund, LEVI, was designed to deliver a step change in the deployment of local, primarily low-powered on-street charging infrastructure across England. It's designed to accelerate the commercialisation and the investment in the local charging infrastructure sector. Furthermore, anybody operating a LEVI that is successful with a LEVI fund and receives funding, your project really should consider the scale, i.e. the level and the spread of the infrastructure, the competitive procurement to maximise your infrastructure provision, private investment. On the back of that, we're anticipating that local authorities will attract high levels of private sector investment. And the whole mantra of this fund is a form of cross-subsidisation to manage the risk around the commercial viability of different charge point sites. For example, balance between rural and urban. Have the next slide, please. So when you think about going out, once you've been successful in terms of your expression of interest as part of your application to the fund, we need to know at OZEV that you understand what is the right power and the specification. And basically, in other words, we need you to develop an electric vehicle infrastructure strategy and a technical specification. We need local authorities to have robust contractual terms which fulfil the strategy and can be supported by the EVI market. And in doing so, you're going to need to have an effective invitation to tender to test the market to achieve these project objectives. One of the ways that you can do that is through a concession contract with an opportunity to leverage high levels of private sector investment while still maintaining control over your location, the type of provision, the quality and the speed of rollout of your on-street infrastructure. Local authorities may provide some capital investment, but we are really expecting them to retain appropriate control over the quality, service and location. This, in doing so, will require local authorities, and I appreciate having worked at a local authority at the moment, having previously worked for local authorities, I do understand that resourcing is somewhat stretched. This is why we've given you that capability fund money, because we are expecting contracts to be managed very robustly with performance monitoring put in place. In terms of that contract, in terms of that concession contract, though, the responsibility of the installation, maintenance and asset utilisation will sit with the service provider. And we do expect to see a contractual relationship between the LA and the service provider is based on the key terms relevant to the LEVI fund and overall strategy. Could I have the next slide, please? So to help local authorities with procurement, specifically for concession contracts, we've produced a heads of terms document. You'll see in the slide pack that there's all hyperlinks there, and they all work. So we have produced, well, the support body who is appointed by us, and this is the contract that I manage, have developed a number of tools to help people at local authority construct their contract and tender. So we've got the heads of terms. We've also got some technical schedules which support the heads of terms. We've got key performance indicator schedules, of which I'll come on to in the next section of the presentation. And we've also produced some guidance on how to evaluate concession contracts. We do advise that you utilise these heads of terms, however, it isn't necessarily mandatory, but if you decide not to, we'd like to see justification as to why you haven't. Could I have the next slide, please? So we're going to look at some of the lessons learned. The first one we're going to look at is contract lengths and extensions. Contract length will significantly increase the quantum of private finance being mobilised, and currently OZEV are recommending a 15-year contract for the Levi Fund. One of the things that we've learned through other types of procurement is that an extension does not necessarily increase the value of the base case of the contract. In certain cases, it might not necessarily improve the initial offer, and any sort of late extension periods in that contract could potentially give away golden years, where the network is actually making a return on investment plus profit. In addition, we also recognise that the market's going to have changed significantly in 10 to 15 years. So do be mindful of offering, for example, a 7+5+3 or a 10+5 type contract, because suppliers will not consider this as a 15-year contract. They will look at it as a 10 or a 7-year contract, as there is a risk of actually not being successful at the end of that for the extension period. And given the likely period, like the time frames for return on investment, that could prove a barrier. Could I have the next slide, please? So another lesson learned that we've come to already is break clauses versus key performance indicators. I know when I worked at local authority, we would have break clauses in our contracts that said we could call off at any time for whatever reason. We're strongly recommending that local authorities don't put that in and actually manage the contract or manage a break clause through key performance indicators. And ultimately, again, this is where it comes down to having very robust contract management procedures in place. And it's not just a case of having key performance indicators for the charge point operator, it's also the charge point operator would want key performance indicators against the authority, because there may be in certain examples where the charge point operator may want to separate themselves from the authority. But again, they would need to have the evidence from a KPI point of view to actually then trigger that. One of the very recent things that has come out in terms of how government likes to manage contracts through KPIs is something called smart KPI objectives. So when you are drafting your KPIs for this, try and utilise the SMART approach, which is specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. What we'd like people to consider is prioritising and ranking your KPIs and consider carefully how these interwork with each other, and base all your performance management on KPI trigger scores. Could I have the next slide, please? So go a little bit further into the key performance indicator things. Again, I've attached the schedules there. And what, again, I'd like people to, what OZEV would like people to consider is think very carefully about what KPIs should be linked with each other in the performance matrix. So here's a very, very silly, simple example. That we've got one KPI that says electric vehicle charging points must be available and functioning 99% of the time, but then another KPI states that 99% of faults with the charge points must be remedied within 1 hour. Now, if you're in a very, very rural setting, that might be incredibly challenging to deal with straight away. So actually consider whether these two examples put together would see a continuous fail by the CPO if you gave them equal weighting in the matrix. So what we'd again like you to consider is think about banded scales and building definitions of default and responsible parties. And hopefully that way you can prioritize what you need to, but also make sure that it's a sensible and equitable field, that you still are in control, but you're managing the contract, but there is still opportunity. You are giving the CPO the best opportunity for you and for your customers. Next slide, please. And that's everything. So if anybody does have any questions, please pop them in the chat, and I'll be happy to field them. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Steve. Next, we have Simon Rook, our Commercial Director at Urban Fox Networks. You're on mute, Simon.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this seminar. Thank you, Stephen, for your presentation. I'm Simon Rook. I'm a Commercial Director at Urban Fox and a long-time Balfour Beatty employee. During that time, I've been involved in delivering many long-term concessions with the public sector, from streetlights to road projects, waste, school and healthcare. And I've learned a lot in that process, and this has informed what I'm presenting today. Obviously, I do work for a charge point operator, but fundamentally, I'm passionate about establishing a commercial structure that gives the best opportunity to deliver the required outcomes in what is really a new asset class on the road network, with an unproven demand picture, particularly in the near home charging sector. So forgive me if the presentation's a little short, but there is more information in our white paper, and we're always ready to discuss it further. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to take you through each of these images in turn, just to build a picture of what's going on. So the transition to a 100% EV fleet is going to unfold over 2 decades, as we all know. And the EV numbers on the road are going to accelerate throughout the next 10 years up to the critical 2035 target and beyond. And the EV charging network is, in my mind, is going to have to grow throughout that time to match the numbers of cars on the road. At the moment, we think EV adoption is outpacing charge point installation, and this graph tries to show that. The yellow boxes show the number of public charge points, and the kind of blue line is showing the number of EVs on the road. And I've used a scale of 1 to 10 to one socket for every 10 vehicles to kind of give a comparator. And there is definitely a gap. So this is impacting the rate. This is going to impact the rate of EV uptake, and it's this very important group that the public funding is targeting. Of course, delivering the growing network will cost a lot of money, and the government has set a target of 300,000 sockets by 2030. I've indicated a rough cost of doing that, and it's probably 3 times the available public funding. But what you can see from following these graphs, which are provided by Climate Change or National Grid, you can find those and probably use them anyway, is that each of the subsequent 5-year periods is going to need the same number of sockets installed. So you can see, getting up to the final position, you're going to need 9 or 10 times the amount of the public funding that is available as of today. And so you need to consider how we can set the structure up in order to mobilize that investment. The good news is the private sector is ready to invest on the right terms, but a balanced contract is needed that reflects and rewards the risks that are transferred. And I'm sure very few people want to be negotiating a bespoke contract for every procurement. So we feel it definitely makes sense to agree a standard form. If that's done, then each authority can tweak the specification within the contract to suit their individual needs so that it becomes bespoke on that basis. If this is done, it'll reduce the cost and time needed to get on and deliver the charger network. Steve mentioned in his slide deck that the OZEV heads of terms suggest that a concession contract of about 15 years as one option for delivering the charging infrastructure. And Transport Scotland and Transport for Wales have similar propositions. We agree that a concession contract is right, but propose a 15-year term is not ambitious enough in leveraging more private investment. And this is because the demand profile for near home charging, as opposed to destination chargers, are less certain and will take some time to develop, because effectively they need to be in place in order to persuade the residents to buy chargers in those locations. Therefore, if you only have a 15-year contract, multiple procurements are likely to be needed, which could result in a range of different offerings and a more inconsistent and confusing delivery strategy for residents and consumers. Better approach, we think, which would leverage at least 3 times more private investment, uses a 5-year core investment period, followed by a 15-year service delivery. During the core investment period, significantly more charge points can be deployed in better locations, responding to feedback from residents, creating more effective long-term employment opportunities, because we can set a plan for local contractors to be delivering those charge points. We're installing charge points throughout the CPO. We'll send a message that a consistent and coherent strategy is in place, and that will give residents confidence to switch to EV, and also with DNOs to plan future reinforcement work that supports that growing network. The impact of this arrangement can be illustrated in the adjacent graph. On the graph, the blue line is the EV sales, the orange line is the number of sockets, and the green dotted line is anticipated utilisation of those sockets. With a 5-year core investment period, the CPO installs charge points just ahead of demand, so the orange line is just ahead of, or in advance of, the blue. Obviously, at this point here, we've got to do some work to get the orange line ahead. As mentioned previously, I'm charging installations and not keeping up with EV sales. So we need to rectify that and then keep just ahead. The amount of the utilization here, you can see obviously on a different scale, but that supports the socket installation. So just hold on, what's happening there? Okay, apologies. So if you have a 15-year type concession, where I've said we typically want to install the charge points in a very short space of time to allow to maximize the return on investment, you're going to have a series of procurements, and that's characterized by more intense installation activity in these locations and these locations, with a lull of activity here and here. If I flick backwards and forwards between them, you can see the utilization curve drops down. So we think lower utilization will result by adopting this approach, which makes it less commercially viable. In addition, we think if all local authorities do it in this way, you're going to have lots of intense activity all around the country, which presents a logistical challenge to deliver. But also means, because there are lulls in activity, there's less ability to provide that kind of long-term employment opportunity. So on this graph, we're just showing that what a 15-year concession would do, short period of installation compared to a longer period with the CIP. If the performance criteria are being met as part of the contract and the expected outcomes are being achieved, then we think it's reasonable to allow subsequent concession agreements to be entered into on a similar structure when the CIP ends, so that you could end up with additional concessions taking you right the way through the transition process to 100% EV fleet. And in that way, you would be able to mobilize 3 times, 6 times, 9 times, or 10 times the amount of private funding from the initial investment made, initial injection of seed capital from public funding. So making use of effective use of the public funds. The public funds for near-home charging in Scotland, Wales and England are available for a relatively short window. I think it's about 2 years. If each authority can propose how they want to use their fund allocation, but this should avoid areas where it's already commercially viable for the private sector to install charge points. I've set out a few areas in the bullets where public funds could be allocated, and some are more obvious than others. Picking on a couple of them, we and other CPOs have a concept of active and passive charge points to future-proof streets following a single civils intervention. It will be commercially viable to activate 2 or 4 sockets in the hub, but not necessarily all of them. So could public funds cover the cost of these passive sockets, and could there be a future credit applied when the passive sockets are activated in the future, so that you could effectively, in a way, recycle the public investment that was originally made? We think that chargers could be installed wherever people own a car and use it regularly, regardless of their circumstances. Their price point for buying an EV may be later than others. That's one reason why the transition to an EV fleet will take so long. But if an authority wants to install chargers in such locations ahead of when it would be commercially viable to do so, then public funds can be deployed for that purpose. One final point from me: we wholeheartedly agree with setting clear outcomes or objectives for the charger network through a KPI network framework as well. However, we can't easily predict the future. So it is vital to have the flexibility in the contract to adjust network growth in line with the emerging demand. And, that could mean speeding it up or slowing it down or changing the location priorities. The goal, though, is to ensure that user demand continues to be met while maintaining commercial viability. Thank you for listening, and I'll now pass over to my colleague, Stephen Rennie.
Thanks, Simon. Yep, now we have Stephen, our bid director at Urban Fox.
Many thanks, Melissa, and thanks, Simon, and hello, everyone. Good morning. Hope you're finding it a useful session so far. So within my slides, I'm going to be looking to share some of the experience and learnings since I came into Urban Fox, which was about 4 months ago, as well as how we view the management of risk across concession contracts. So in terms of my background, I've been in the EV charging world for about 13 years now. So in theory, I should be old and jaded, but fortunately, it has been quite an exciting industry. So I started at the Energy Saving Trust, where I managed funding streams for local authority charge point rollouts, and then I led the transport team there. Also had a couple of previous roles with charge point suppliers over a 6-year period. And then for the last 2.5 years before I joined Urban Fox, I was managing the rollout of charging infrastructure for Scottish Water. So within all those roles, I've really seen the various sides of procurement from both the buyer and the supplier side. And it's tricky. I mean, that's my main learning so far. I will try and give you more insight than that. But the overriding experience is it's tricky. I'm particularly as a buyer and releasing tenders with the appropriate contract terms that minimise risk for the buyer, as well as ensuring a good delivery partner. It's not been easy, and that's what I'm going to be looking to focus on in the next few slides. If I could have the next slide there, please. So for me, coming into a company as part of the Balfour Beatty Group, it's really been a good eye-opener in terms of a sensible attitude towards managing and balancing risk. So we've been around in the public infrastructure field for over 100 years, so it's lots of experience for us to draw on, and that includes around 30 years of delivering long-term concession contracts for public sector. And you simply don't last that long, really, without a balanced approach to managing risk. And in an ideal world for these concession contracts, that's what we're really looking for, is both the supplier and the local authority to have a balanced risk profile. I think it's probably fair to say that the charge point industry is still in its infancy in many ways. And I think with any young industry, you're going to get highly competitive marketplace, and you're going to see quite a broad spectrum of approaches to risk across suppliers. And that's not necessarily criticism of others at all. Obviously, it's up to each supplier what level of appetite at risk they have, and some have done very well with that up to this stage. But what is crucial, and I don't think can be argued, that it's very important for councils to minimise their risk. If I give you an example, in the last working group for CPOs that we had for OZEV, there was a very clear request from OZEV to CPOs to stop agreeing to contractual terms during the tender process, and then attempting to renegotiate them upon tender award, and actually then going on to try and resist termination. So it's very clear to us that there's risks out there from a buyer point of view, and we definitely think there's some ways for councils to protect themselves from that level of risk. Could I have the next slide again, please? So our approach in the market up to this stage, it's really been fairly selective, actually, in terms of the opportunities that we bid for. And this, I think, in every case has really been down to the balance of contractual risk for us. And in my mind, that's what a local authority should really want in a supplier, someone who does their due diligence in terms of risk for what is a high level of investment and long-term contracts, just making sure really that they can deliver sustainable long-term contracts. It just fundamentally means the supplier is going to be around for the long term if they've done that due diligence. So just in relation to that general point, I've just got some general common contract concerns within this slide that we see amongst most tenders, to be honest. So I think Simon's covered the area of contract term and managing utilisation. I guess the only point I would add to that is in terms of the length of contracts, which I think Steve from OZEV and ourselves are in agreement with 15 years plus. And what that allows for us actually is quite a high level of social value investment that we can make. And it's been very heartening for me actually coming into the organisation to see the level of investment that's there for social value. The point around managing change, that's really just a point about keeping the outcomes relevant within what is a fast changing market and having the contractual mechanisms to manage such change. KPIs, Steve touched upon this well actually, and we're in agreement that KPIs clearly should be encouraged as a performance management tool. We're more than happy to be judged on our performance as we should be. And we'd certainly agree about the point about prioritising and ranking KPIs. There's definitely a danger, I think, of KPI overload in some cases and potential double counting across similar KPIs. So for us, it should really be about what focused KPIs help you achieve your desired outcomes, which, I mean, fundamentally, I think for everyone is a reliable and well-maintained network with good customer service. We aim to be fully transparent and reporting those KPIs. So we give clients access to our systems in terms of being able to see faults, fault resolution, timeframes, etc. So we try and have an open book approach, which I think is only fair. And we'd seek a reasonable and fair approach for both parties. We believe that all contracts, for instance, should have arrangements for termination, including reasons for underperformance. We do, as Steve said, though, we'd always recommend the supplier has the opportunity to remedy for any performance issues, and low default thresholds for early termination can cause issues. And hopefully it's clear that termination without reason clauses don't really work in fully funded deals. We have seen those clauses within some recent tenders as an example, which is a concern. Exclusivity is an area that we see approached differently actually in many tenders that have been released. We'd always be seeking a level of geographical exclusivity, which I think the OZEV heads of terms have some good guidance on. It just gives us more confidence really in future utilisation levels. It rightly rewards investment in the early years when the utilisation risk is high for suppliers. And it also gives us the opportunity to expand further when certain utilisation levels are reached. In terms of tariffs, it's definitely an interesting topic. I'm going to move on in the next slide to talk about revenue sharing tariffs, but within this slide, I just wanted to touch upon, again, minimising risk within this area. We see a lot of tenders and contracts coming out which ask suppliers to propose tariffs with revenue share percentages and then propose an annual review, which is all well and good, but often there's quite a clear lack of definition around what that review is based on. And our fear, I guess, is without that definition, suppliers could, in theory, give and be scored on quite a low CPO profit in tender submissions, which can then be increased at a later stage. So yeah, just wanted to point out that risk concern. If I can move on to the next slide again there, please. Thank you. So looking here at the four components that typically combine to set the tariff that's charged to consumers, and I should just stress that diagram's just for indicative purposes, so please don't get your protractors out and try and work out exact percentages. It's just indicative. So really the biggest variable and the biggest chunk of that tariff is electricity costs and associated transaction costs, which we don't have any control over. We're happy to have conversations with local authorities as to whether it makes sense to utilise your own electricity contracts. Local authorities might well have lower rates, which can mean a lower end tariff for users, which I think we'd all be in agreement is a good thing. In terms of the local authority margin, ideally we see that should be expressed as a pence per kilowatt hour. It's the most transparent model and it's less open to misinterpretation or even manipulation, and would recommend ideally that this kicks in at an agreed utilisation level. Otherwise, there's an increased CPO risk in the early years when a CPO may well be losing money. We've also got a portion there for the CPO fee. Again, we would recommend that being expressed within contracts and tenders as a pence per kilowatt hour fixed starting amount, was just simply index linked over the contract term. And we're happy for that fee to be dug into in further detail with our clients. So in terms of the percentage for installation, hardware, O&M, etc., and profit. As mentioned earlier, there should be protections in there against this rising, other than with inflation, as it does give CPOs a potential loophole. And then we've got VAT in there at 20%, which, you know, obviously we'd all agree. We hope that gets reduced to 5%, which would make it in line with the VAT paid by those folk fortunate enough to have a home charger, and we just provide more equality across the population. So hopefully that gives you some quite quick insight into what we feel is the most transparent and low risk approach for local authorities and CPOs. I don't think we're a lone voice with a lot of these points. We've got the OZEV heads of terms that Steve mentioned. Scottish Futures Trust have just published some guidance that I'd certainly advise people to have a look at, with some very sensible points in there. We know the Oxford DPS concession contract template is under review due to feedback in a number of these areas. And as Simon said, we've got a white paper that we'll be delighted to share with any of our local authority prospective customers to give wider thoughts on this. If I could just have the last slide there, please. So I really just wanted to finish on some learnings really from the last few months of looking at ITTs that have been released. Apologies as well, as I appreciate there's a number of procurement specialists on the call, so my intention is not to teach you how to suck eggs, but I thought it would be useful to give some thoughts from a supplier's perspective on a few points. We see a lot of tenders being released with a 4 to 5 week response time, which really just doesn't give enough time in terms of the due diligence and governance approval processes you'd want your suppliers to go through. So ideally for these large investment, longer term contracts, we would be seeking an 8-week minimum period for responses. But I mean, ideally, to be honest, 12 weeks. And as a local authority, I mean, it's so worthwhile to give that additional time. You want your supplier to have gone through all their due diligence, reviewed contract terms, sought sign off on investment, done the appropriate data analysis, etc. So although it's a few extra weeks, it's add huge value in terms of minimising risk of contracts. In terms of clarifications, the process, we quite often, and certainly recently, have seen clarifications answered quite late in the process, and sometimes can just fundamentally change approaches to tenders. So we would just ask for a timely clarification response if possible. In terms of the quality responses, I certainly feel, looking at it, if we get 1,500 words, for example, per quality question, that I think gives us enough time to really set out our offering in enough detail to give local authorities confidence. Where it has been 500 or 1,000 words, you're ending up cramming stuff in or missing stuff out potentially. And again, just I appreciate reading these. If they're 1,500 words per question, can be a laborious process, but that's our job, I guess, to jazz them up a bit. But it does add value, and again, I think just minimises risk for local authorities. And I touched upon this earlier, but just a final point about providing clarity in the commercial scoring submission requirements, just again coming from the point of minimising risk for local authorities. And the outcome that we all want really is a well-maintained and reliable EV charging network for all. I've been a driver for probably a decade of electric vehicles, on this side of it now in terms of suppliers, but without that well-maintained, reliable network, the EV transition will be massively hampered. So we're very keen to ensure that the tender process and contractual process minimises those risks. And that's me. Actually, we've got one more slide with some contact details there. If we want to move on to that, please feel free to get in touch. As Simon mentioned, we've got a white paper we're happy to share. And I think now we've probably got time for a discussion, Melissa.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Stephen. We've heard lots of great insights from the panel. Now we're going to have a bit of a moderated discussion. We have a couple of questions for our panelists, and then we'll move on to answering some questions from the live Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, please add it to the Q&A feature on your screen. The first question is for Steve. Do OZEV have any plans to avoid local authorities publishing their ITTs at the same time?
I think the challenge that we've got with that is that obviously everybody's at different stages of with their application and when funding comes in, and we've obviously been very transparent about post-approval action plans for certain authorities, and obviously we're going to give that sign off. So inevitably there will be a risk that there could be lots of authorities going to the market. I think our challenge is I'm not sure how we could really stop that in that sense, because we're issuing the funding. We want people to go out to market, but we want them to go out when they feel that they've got the right tender and everything's correct and ready. So inevitably there will be some bunching. How we're going to achieve that, how we're going to thin that out, I'm not entirely sure. But we are mindful of that, and we're trying to give as much transparency to local. We're trying to give as much transparency to CPOs about when local authorities are potentially going out to tender, so they can ready themselves to respond to those bids.
Thank you. The next question is for Simon. What do you see as the biggest challenge or barrier to your commercial approach?
I think probably ownership of the idea is probably as much as anything. It's a perception that, if the private sector are proposing it, there must be something tainted by definition with it. But in a nutshell, I think what Stephen and I have proposed here is twofold. Firstly, having a longer core investment period followed by 15 years of service delivery. That's actually a public sector idea, and it's drawn from street lighting projects, which work really well for both sides. It's one of the most successful, I think, of the PPPs that I've ever worked on. It's a relatively simple product, and it just worked. Having a standard form of contract with a balanced risk allocation agreed at the outset rather than negotiated, well, that is the standard way that long-term concessions have always been done in the past. So it looks really odd to me that that isn't being adopted in this case, and relying on, the heads of terms are a useful starting point. But if a local authority doesn't have the negotiating, the time and resource to negotiate their own contract, you're going to end up with multiple different forms of contract that are all linked in some way to those heads of terms, but are all slightly different. And that becomes really difficult to manage for a CPO looking at 15 contracts, all slightly different. And it becomes very difficult for local authorities to say, we've got a particular issue on this one, and our contract looks like this. They talk to another local authority, their contract looks slightly different. It's very difficult to provide that kind of advice across the local authorities. So is it a barrier? I don't know. I think I think what we're trying to propose here should make sense. It's good practical learning from previous experience, and I hope that it can be adopted.
Simon, a question for Stephen. What do you think will happen if local authorities do not publish more appropriate contracts?
Well, I guess we'll find out in the next 12 months or so. And I don't want to sound too critical at all. You know, I'm not trying to say that every ITT that comes out is an inappropriate contract by any means. But as I said, there are certainly ITTs being released that we've not backed because of contractual reasons. Well, I think realistically, as Steve was saying, there's going to be a lot of tenders coming out over the next 12 months. You know, 60 odd local authorities in the first phase of Levi, 32 Scottish local authorities, Welsh local authorities. So I think it's inevitable that suppliers will have no choice but to choose the ones that give them a more balanced risk profile, I guess. So my concern would be, you know, actually we've had a couple of tenders when it came out before Christmas, and both of them I think only got one respondent, and I think I'm fairly sure that was due to contractual concerns, and we certainly had a contractual concern. We had a tender released that we get notification of yesterday has been pulled from the market because they're going to amend the contract paperwork and go out and re-advertise again. So I think inevitably the issue is going to be either a low number of respondents for some tenders or a low number of respondents for some tenders, and that may mean going with a supplier that a local authority may not want to, but may not have any choice to. So yeah, so that's my concern. And my wider concern is just, well, what does that mean in 5 years' time for EV drivers or actually the market? That's my wider concern, I guess.
Steve, you got your hand up?
If I could just come in to sort of add a bit of support and weight to what Stephen's just said there. One of the things that we are encouraging, and we are seeing through folks that are looking to procure through some of these frameworks, is the opportunity to try and create additional lots. So where you've got funding for things like taxis or blue light services, etc., that you actually pull together and issue one ginormous tender that incorporates a number of those different funding streams, because ultimately, let's face it, we're delivering charge points here. That's the thing, and we've got charge point operators that deliver charge points. So if you can scale up your procurement to include some of these other funding streams for getting charge points in, that may be a lot more attractive to a CPO, given the size and the scale of the work, which may encourage more people to come to market. However, that is a recommendation, not an insistence.
Thank you. Just conscious of the time, I'm just going to take one of the chats from the Q&A. The questions for Steve. OZEV KPI guidelines list 25 different example KPIs. How many do you think would be an appropriate quantity? You're on mute, Steve.
That's the first time I've done that today. It's normally a classic with me. So when you look at the KPI schedules, if you look at the sort of the principles column, actually you can lump quite a few of those. There's broad themes, do you know what I mean, when we look through. So if you look at the first four, they all kind of fall into one. And then if you look at some of the latter ones, they all fall particularly into things like the customer focused network. Modern KPI management suggests, and I'm doing a contract management course at the moment, and this was what we learned last week. So this is very much like hot off the press in terms of how governments see things going, is that by utilising smart KPIs, ideally on any contract, you don't want more than 10. But this is where we talk about having a matrix, so that you might have 10 themes and then there's smaller KPIs under that. I think it's really important that you look at what's important to you as the authority, what's important to the charge point operator. And in certain cases, you might want to negotiate between the two pairs in terms of your mobilisation about that type of matrix. But I would strongly recommend that you look through the KPI schedules, find the ones that are most important to you, and also look where you can group stuff together under one larger umbrella and manage it that way. There is no one size fits all for this because every authority is so different. So it's very much about what's important to you and your taxpayers. Simon, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. When I look at the public sector charge point regulations, they set a number of really useful targets and reference points for what a good public charge point network should look like. And I think setting your KPIs around that is a useful starting point. There may be some other particular outcomes within a local authority that are required, but if you have too many KPIs, then actually it becomes burdensome for both the public and the private sector to administer that. And actually they could over time become they could be working against each other. I mean, you could try to achieve this KPI, but then you're not achieving that. And so I would advocate against having too many. I think 10 would be high, to be honest with you. And certainly if you had subsets of KPIs within that, it just becomes a very difficult thing to manage. And that just adds cost to the whole system, which feeds through to ultimately a high tariff for consumers. And we're trying to compete here against people who have a drive and can access cheap electricity from their home and charge their cars here. And we're trying to encourage those people that don't have a drive to make that transition to EV. So it's really a plea to think about how we can create a system that stands at least a fair chance of providing a near home charging tariff that gets closer towards what it would cost someone who had a drive.
Simon. Another question for Steve. Oxford City Council are the only DPS that currently offer a contract template, but it is different to current recommended guidelines and do not offer a balanced risk profile. Will OZEV be liaising with OCC to address this?
I believe that work's underway already.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware, I know that they are making changes to that, as Stephen highlighted as well. We do also have Crown Commercial Services, and I believe that we're looking to get Commercial Services Limited, who are a wholly owned subsidiary of Kent County Council, on board as well, to provide a procurement platform, as they seem to have a lot of expertise in the electric vehicle charge point framework side of things.
Thank you. I've got a question in the Q&A. What do Stephen and Simon feel about a two-stage procurement process with the local authority giving feedback to initial ITT submission and allowing CPOs to revise their submission and resubmit?
It seems a sensible proposal from my side of things. I mean, I guess the only risk would be if we have this avalanche of tenders and each one is a longer drawn out process. What does that mean? But I've certainly, from the other side as a buyer, run procurement processes and had an interview stage and really unpicking or trying to get a bit more detail on what's been written down. So yeah, I think you can get valuable feedback during that process. Like I say, my slight concern would be if there's 60 of those extended processes going on at one time. But yeah, the principle sounds sensible to me.
Yeah,
I would definitely agree there, Stephen. I think, you know, if you can get that opportunity and you build that into your tender to have those negotiations, that's only ever going to deliver a win-win.
I mean, the sad reality is, you know, stuff gets written in black and white, and it's maybe until you have those conversations, you can actually dig into the detail of it.
Thanks. That's another question for Simon or Stephen on commercial structure. What is the impact if LAs choose to use the heads of terms and align with Levi conditions?
Well, the terms and the heads of terms that OZEV have provided, and a similar thing for Transport Scotland and Transport for Wales, they provide a sensible discussion document. They've got all the right ideas contained in it, but there isn't kind of one set approach for each of those terms. So the contract that could result from that could comply with the heads of terms, but it's very weighted in favour of a local authority, or perversely weighted in favour of the private sector, just because you take the lowest common denominator in each of those recommendations. And sometimes in the heads of terms, there isn't even a recommendation. So it's just a discussion of what you should consider. So I don't particularly have a problem with the local authority taking those heads of terms and coming up with a contract, but I think it isn't really their role to do that. I think a central organisation should transfer that heads of terms into a contract that a local authority could use, because then it's done once rather than 70 or 80 different times.
I think there's a value within that of wider dialogue with CPOs and local authorities in terms of market engagement, and just having those conversations. I appreciate that maybe lengthens the process, but to my mind, lengthening the process at the start can save so much pain later on down the line that it would definitely be worth it, in my view. So yeah, sitting around the table and having these discussions directly with CPOs and local authorities is of huge value. Oh, you're on mute, Melissa. It's my turn.
I had to do it once. Another question, maybe for Simon. Have you got any data on expected use of on-street chargers by 1, private car owners, and 2, fleet or co-owned cars and vans?
This is the big problem, right? For near home charging, it's very difficult to forecast how the demand picture will grow, and effectively, you know, you're installing charge points in the near home sector as a prompt to people to purchase a car. For destination chargers, kind of the other way, they're feeding a demand that is already emerging, and they can already see within a catchment area how many EV cars are there, and they will come to that footfall location. But predicting it for near home is very difficult, and it will emerge over time, and we'll get better at finding the right locations for that. But we're almost kind of putting it's not as unthought through as putting a pin in the map. You know, there is a lot of data out there about which streets have the most number of people that park on a drive. Local authorities are getting data from their residents saying, we'd like to have we'd like to have an EV charge point in our street. We've got an EV car, or we're going to buy an EV car. That's all useful data. And we should also be having conversations with the fleet owners, because they can't do all their charging at fleet depots. A lot of the fleet vans will be parking on streets, and if they can share the data about where those cars are, then we can provide that information and provide the charge points in the locations. Also, we should be talking with car share, or hourly rental cars, the people having that, because we can provide the electric charge points to serve those vehicles, and that may well be a very useful alternative to actually owning a car in the future.
Just to add to that, sorry, Melissa, I'm conscious of time. To add to that very quickly. So even though we've got 50 different data sets that come into our data analytics in terms of finding locations, but even with that, there is still a very risk higher utilization, and we've seen figures over the years of projected utilization which local authorities get presented, which we think is very over optimistic in terms of what's achievable. So it would just be a warning shot, or warning, I guess, to local authorities to be wary of very high utilization projections that are given by suppliers, and then basing your revenue potentially off that. It's we need to acknowledge it's going to be a slow market in terms of utilization for many on-street locations. I'll shut up now.
I just have one more question. It's come from Tim. Do OZEV intend to release a standardised contract, as Simon suggests?
To my knowledge, the best of my knowledge at the moment, no, I don't think we are. I could be wrong on that. I shall take that away and check. I believe currently we want local authorities to draft and design their own contracts, because everybody's so unique and so different, and there are different challenges in different areas, and therefore actually a one size fits all may not deliver the best outcome. However, I can definitely see in certain cases there might be some benefits to that. So I'll take that away, Tim, and if you could drop me an email, and my email's at the end of the presentation, and I'm sure everybody that comes along today is going to get a copy of this. Is that right, Melissa?
Yeah, we're going to send out the
amazing. So, yeah,
the white paper.
That's amazing. You'll have my contact details there, so do drop me an email, Tim, as a prompt. But I will take that away and ask the question, because I can see pros and cons for both sides of this. Do you know what I mean? But I know at the moment, I think we're very keen for local authorities to build and design their own, because of the, how can I put it, just the very stochastic nature of the makeup of England, for want of a better word. Do you know what I mean? We've got some very densely populated urban areas, and we've got some very, very sparsely populated rural areas.
Thank you. Just conscious we've run over slightly, so thank you for everyone that's made it this far. As I said, we'll be sending out a copy of our white paper and the slides that our panel shared today to everyone that's attended. Just hope the webinar was helpful, and if you have any other questions, please get in touch via our website, which is urbanfox.network. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.